no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
Will is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Well, welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. I'm here with President Rick Esenberg, who is back as our co-host for episode 2 of season 2. This is really a can't miss episode. If you're interested in hearing why things are so expensive, why housing is driving up, the costs of just really everyday living, we have an episode just for you. So it's the top of mind for so many voters and people across Wisconsin, folks across the country. So we're going to dive into affordability. We're going to dive into the cost of home ownership, touch on inflation. We're going to answer this question about the $100,000 salary and if it's really the $100,000 salary that it used to be. And of course, everything deals with politics. And as the famous saying goes, it's the economy stupid. So we're going to tackle policy solutions to affordability, look at what Republicans and Democrats or red states and blue states are doing, and then talk about what conservatives can do to really win the messaging battle on affordability. So here to break it all down with me, like always, is President and founder Rick Esenberg, and our special guest, Patrick McIlheran from the Badger Institute. He is their director of policy, and he's written a number of articles on housing and affordability, especially here in Wisconsin. Let's talk about affordability. Rick, we hear about it every single day. It's a buzzword in politics. It's also a kind of a political wedge issue of some kind. We seem to be in an affordability crisis. And so what would you say to maybe the millennial right now who has a home in San Francisco making $150,000 a year and says they're living paycheck to paycheck?
Well, I would say, part of your problem is that you live in San Francisco. I mean, it's always been the case that there were parts of the country that you might move to in which what would appear to be a very good salary elsewhere wouldn't be sufficient. Now, when I was a law student, those many years ago, I was absolutely convinced that I was going to move to Los Angeles. That was the plan. And when I would get I could get a job there with a law firm. I would make a very, very good salary, but it wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be close to enough to buy a house in Los Angeles in 1981. I spent a summer in New York City working for a law firm on Wall Street. It was very, very expensive to live in New York City. So that's part of the problem. The second part of a thing that I'd say is that politicians always have a tendency to exaggerate what's happening right now. And we've had this phenomenon for the last, 15, 20 years that you might call nostalgianomics. And there was this idea that, if you go back to the 1950s, if you go back to the 60s or even the 70s, that everything was just wonderful, that you could have a guy with no particular skill could go get a job doing, turning a ratchet all day in a factory and would be able to buy this house, have a stay-at-home wife, and even maybe have a lake home or a boat. And I got to tell you that I was there in 1969. I was in a working class family. I remember it. We lived in a 900 square foot house with 2 bedrooms and 1 bath. We never had more than 1 car. And the car we had was an AMC Hornet. And I remember one time going to close the hood because we had to fix it ourselves. We couldn't rely on a mechanic. And I bent the hood in 2. Right. And I was able to bend it back because it was that pliable. I never went on a plane until I was 22 when I left for law school. I'm sorry, but things weren't exactly the way that they are often represented on X. Having said that, I wouldn't deny that we have had a very, very serious increase. And Pat, I think, and Badger did a nice job of showing how that's worked in the last 4 or 5 years. But when interest rates spiked up, because of certain dynamics in the housing market, which suppress supply, we had a bump in housing affordability. That needs to work itself out. There are some policy solutions for that, but I don't think the American dream is dead.
Why do you think then millennials, maybe right now, the ones we see on Twitter, the ones you're responding to on Twitter per se, why do you think they have why do you think they're living paycheck to paycheck? Like, where are they going on too many bachelor parties? Are they going out to eat too much?
So here's the deal. Like I graduated from law school and I got a job, for with Foley and Lardner, and I made way more than the average person makes starting back in 1981. I have to tell you, I was living paycheck to paycheck for a long time. This idea that we keep reading posts on Twitter and things that express this outrage that people who are 65 or 70 years old have more assets than people that are 25, as if nothing that happens in your life will ever increase your wealth. I think that that's preposterous. I do think there is a problem right now with the ability of young people to get into the housing market. That's a real problem that requires real attention. It's not because anybody did anything to anybody else. It's because we had a combination of very low rates, and we have a series of regulations and zoning laws that suppress housing supply. That's one problem. The second problem is that we've now had a 40-year period in which higher education increased at rates which far exceeded the inflation rate. I think that was to a large degree a matter of government policy. Back when I was, I hate this because now I'm playing the boomer, right? I keep saying back when I was a young guy, but when I was in law school, there was a limit on what you could borrow, and that placed a limit on what places like Harvard could charge. And those limits are not as stringent. They're there, but they're not as stringent as they once were. And universities have taken advantage of that. And they've created these wonderlands, which will be the best place that these kids ever live. Like, I went to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We never imagined that we would have a lazy river that flowed through campus. But the problem is that the cost of this has just gotten way too high, and I don't think that kids are getting good advice on how to use their money. I mean, if you borrow $200,000 to go to Thomas Jefferson Law School, that may be wonderful. You'll get to be a lawyer and you'll learn a lot of good stuff about the law, but don't think you're going to get a job that will justify and allow you to borrowing $200,000 and allow you to repay it, because the odds are that you won't. And we knew that back in 1978. I knew I couldn't go get a degree in political science and then expect to work in my field at a good salary. I knew I had to go to law school. That was it. That was the game. And I sometimes I think that there's kind of a denial or failure to acknowledge that right now. But I think higher education and housing costs have really they have hit younger people, and I think we should be concerned about that. We also should be concerned about the coming cost of entitlements, which are largely Social Security and Medicare. I don't like this anti-boomer stuff that goes on, but something is going to have to be done about that, and I don't see how that something will not include benefit cuts, particularly for higher income seniors.
I do think, and Patrick, we're about to bring you in here. I do think entitlements is a huge part of this. I do want, since we have the expert, I think for some of what we're seeing here in Wisconsin, especially, and that's Patrick at the Badger Institute. Patrick, why don't you just respond a little bit to what Rick said, but also what is affecting housing specifically here in Wisconsin? We're the Milwaukee Metro and Dane County, I think, they're seeing prices explode. I just bought a house a couple years ago. Other people are going through the same thing. Talk about what we're seeing and why.
Well, we are seeing housing prices are turning upward. Our research on it was to take a look at there are numbers compiled by Zillow Research. Zillow, actually, it's the website that does real estate listings. They have a sideline of tracking a lot of data, since a lot of it flows through their hands. And we were able to come up with some numbers such as the income share that a median household would have to spend on a newly purchased house. It's fascinating that it's not just Madison and Milwaukee. It's a lot of cities across the state, Eau Claire area, Fond du Lac, Green Bay, this sort of thing. And they all have curves that look about the same. It was slightly rising, mostly flat, until everybody took a sharp upturn right around in 2021 when the inflation hit. It's the same thing when it comes to how much of an income you would have to be able to afford the median house in cities in Wisconsin. Again, a sharp inflection point at 2021. What that tells you is that aside from whatever long-term changes there are, and those are real, Rick is absolutely on target with the standard of living was different back in the so-called golden era. But on top of that, there really was a sharp change about the time inflation hit. Nothing like seeing, well, remember what inflation is. It's the devaluation of a dollar. It's the price of everything goes up because the dollars are actually worth less. And that really did hit us. It hit the country in 2021. It hit us in a very bad way. Your dollars really did become worth 9% less a year for about 2 years. And suddenly that means that you're just buying less. It's going to cost you more. Incomes didn't rise at the same rate as everything else did. And that smacks a lot of people upside the head. The last time we saw inflation of that rate was in the late 1970s. And that was enough to produce what amounts to something close to a regime change. Jimmy Carter was out of office, Ronald Reagan was into it, and there was a wholesale upset of what had been a stable political consensus for decades in the wake of World War II. Suddenly it all shifted. Why? Because inflation will do that to people. Suddenly they can't afford a house, they can't afford a lot of things. And that's a lot of what's happening with houses. Inflation really did a number on housing. Some other things did too, and there are some ways we can get around that. But I mean, that's your big inflection point that shows up in the data, bright as day.
I'd like to dive into that a little bit more, especially like, I want to just use the label of blue states, like maybe a little bit more of the left of center policies, more government control, things like that, versus, I think like Florida and Texas, right? I think there's this narrative kind of in some of these other states about like build, baby, build versus, what we're seeing in certain states where they might see population decline and housing prices continue to go up. Where is Wisconsin on that? And why is it where it is?
What I was just talking about was a change over time. So then there's the other dimension of it, which is how does Wisconsin fare compared to other states? Well, middling. The National Association of Realtors does surveys on this because they're made up of thousands of people who make a living on being able to sell houses. So they do want to track whether people can afford what's being offered. Otherwise, they're out of business. Their numbers are pretty good. Wisconsin's about middling for affordability. We're less so than, say, Iowa or Indiana. We are less affordable. Metro Madison, Metro Milwaukee are less affordable than Metro Chicago, for instance. Not much, but some. We're much more affordable than more or less everybody west of the Great Plains. Montana's a terrible place to be able to afford a house. They don't have enough of them, which is odd given that it's a place with a whole lot of land in it and not a lot of people. But some of this gets to not to give away the game here, but a lot of it depends on your permission to build a house. Part of what restrains housing, what makes houses expensive in, say, San Francisco or the New York area is it's hard to find a place to actually put a house. There's water, there's mountains, there's an ocean on one side. Whereas here, of course, it's yes, there's Lake Michigan, but we do have a lot of land in Wisconsin, a lot of cornfields on which you can plop down a house, or at least in terms of physics, you could. The question is whether you have permission to do so, because that's the prerequisite. You have to actually get a permit from a government, generally a local one, to put up a house on land. And part of the conditions of that permit will be that you must have a lot of a particular size. You must make a house of a particular shape or square footage, or of certain materials. And these rules tend to add up. They go into making housing more expensive. They also go into making it harder to build houses, which is why we've seen part of why we have seen a fall off in the number of houses that are being built in Wisconsin in the past decade or so.
I think that's true. There's a lot of, NIMBYism, not in my backyard, that goes on. I live in a neighborhood where we actually have 5 acre zoning, right? You minimum of 5 acres to build a house. My house is grandfathered. We only have two, but there was a proposal to reduce it to 3 acres, and there was tremendous local opposition, was ultimately overridden. But that drives up the cost of housing. Brought at the same time, I had to build a shed, and basically it was a shed, but it was really kind of a one-car garage that I wanted to have in my backyard. And I had to go to the architectural review board in my community, and I sat there for an hour and I listened to what they did, and they did it to me too, but they repeatedly reviewed plans and looked at them and said, you know what? I'd like to see this on that house. I'd like to see that on that house. I think you should have the same finish on the back that nobody sees as you do on the front that faces the road, because we just think that's better. And so, this type of and I know that, Pat and Badger had a great article showing what percentage of this is the cost of housing is attributed to excessive regulation. But that's part of the problem. I mean, I mentioned before the kind of house that I grew up in, and a lot of people grew up in, and I don't know if you could even build a house like that in most communities. It would be too small. It would be too plain. People wouldn't like it. And so I think that if you want to have a 1960s like housing market, uh, and I think sometimes we overstate how easy it was to buy a house back then. But if you want, there is a long-term secular trend in, housing affordability becoming more difficult and difficult. I mean, you can see it. It's a big 50-year chart, and the line goes up. But if we're going to have that, then we're going to have to go back a little bit closer to the rules that we have, right? So, we've just finished the Christmas season. Everybody watched It's a Wonderful Life. If you didn't watch It's a Wonderful Life, you should have watched It's a Wonderful Life.
Very
Look
true.
at
Very
the
true.
houses that the Bailey Building and Loan were building for the Martinis. They were these little things, that were very, very small, but it allowed people to have. I can't remember what the phrase that Jimmy Stewart uses. T- t- five measly rooms or something like that. But that's what we did, and that's what, if people are nostalgic for that time, that's what you had in that time.
I think if you go and see a lot of the criticism of of affordability and like how hard it is to buy a home, it's like the boomers who love capitalism are being blamed, right? And it's like capitalism is the problem. Like, and I think it's just complete opposite what we're seeing, and it's hard because local government, which is often the most intrusive, often flies under the radar. But it's the local government in a lot of ways making these decisions to make housing far more inaccessible by just not allowing us to build, is what it sounds like.
I mean, if we're talking about, and yes, if life is unaffordable, then housing is a key element. I mean, we're talking 30% of people's spending ideally, and frankly, it's higher than that in some places and for some people. So yeah, this is a huge thing. So what's the solution? Fix housing. But what's the solution on housing? Well, at that point, you start saying Thomas Sowell had it right. There are no solutions. There are trade-offs. One of the trade-offs that's possible is, yeah, accept a 900 square foot house with 2 bedrooms in it. And people do. I know a couple. They've lived in West Dallas for about 30 years. Their house is paid off. Middle class, they have good income. But they decided to stay put in the house in West Dallas on a whatever size of West Dallas-y lot. That's I gotta think it's about 1/5 of an acre, something like that. It's a Cape Cod. It's nice, but it's small. But that's fine. It worked. And now their house is paid off. Mine is not. For career reasons, we moved around. Fascinating thing. So we sold, we moved to the East Coast for a while for job reasons. Sold a house in Bayview in 2011. Sold it for, I want to say, about $150,000. That house now, I looked it up because you can look up property records. That house now is going for about $400,000. Stunning what has happened. It's not as if the house changed. It's not as if the lot changed. The value changed because there are more people looking to get into that neighborhood. So one of the trade-offs we could have is there's a lot of comparatively affordable housing in Milwaukee, city of Milwaukee. There are even a lot of vacant lots in Milwaukee. Why aren't people building houses on them? Because it's kind of an unsafe neighborhood. It's places that are ridden with crime. So one of the trade-offs is society willing to come up with solutions for crime, do things that are necessary to reduce the crime rate? Let's ask, I'm sure that's another podcast entirely about the broken windows approach to solving crime, but are you willing to do that? That's one of the trade-offs. One of the trade-offs is, are you willing to give up the view of a bean field across the street? So for instance, I'm going to take this example here. This is one that's current in northwest suburban Milwaukee, about Germantown. Germantown has like most communities in Wisconsin, like all communities in Wisconsin are legally required to have, and has a comprehensive plan. This is where the citizens and planners get together and work out for the next 10 years. Here's what we envision growth will look like. We'll have houses here, apartments there, stores there, that sort of thing. There's a corner of Germantown near Lannon Road, County Line Road, right by I-41, near the exit there, where it's agriculture now. There's some farm fields. There's a row of houses that have been there for a couple decades, large lots. The community plan says that the farm fields there are supposed to eventually grow into single-family houses and duplexes. A developer, I want to say about a year ago, proposed single-family homes and duplexes. Nice-looking plan. Had ponds, had trees to shelter the view of the new development from the existing houses. Existing neighbors complained. They said they like their view of the bean field and they want it to stay. What is the mechanism that gives them the ability to do that? Because the land is still zoned. That is, what you have permission to put on the land, it's still zoned for agriculture. Despite the comprehensive plan for Germantown saying that Germantown as a community agreed that would be houses. The zoning doesn't agree with that. So one possible thing to do would be to adjust state law, and there are proposals to do this, so that zoning has to conform to a comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is come up with in a public sort of process, very deliberative, very arm's length, and cool heads are prevailing in theory, whereas zoning tends to be a matter of, well, a developer needs to get a zoning change on this land before he can put a shovel in the ground. And the neighbors can show up at the zoning board's hearing and complain and say, no, we like our field there. And the neighbors vote, the developer doesn't. More importantly, the people who eventually would live in those houses, they don't have a vote either. So who are the local officials going to listen to?
Oh, yeah, that's a great point.
It's kind of a problematic dynamic there. Maybe we'll want to look at some trade-offs. Everybody and his dog likes local control. I know we at Badger Institute do, but to what extent are we willing to trade that off for the ability of people to find a place to live?
Well, I think local control has really empowered almost a lot of authoritarian style policies at the local level is kind of what I think, it's the trade-off we're talking about. And I don't know if Rick would agree with that, but that's my assessment.
I found that out when I tried to build a shed. They insisted that I put a window on a side of the shed, which is 2 feet away from woods, right? So I got a window now where I can be in my shed and I can look out at branches that are 12 inches away from the window because that's what they do. They want symmetry. And
And
so,
from their standpoint, that's a very low cost ask.
yeah,
I mean, they
10%
can
of the
make the
cost,
ask.
but yeah.
Right. From their standpoint, from the standpoint of the authorities, yeah, we can, since we're putting on demands, we can put on demands for stone facing on the back.
Well, we talked a little bit about obviously zoning could be addressed more at a state level policy, right? I think that's what Patrick was getting at. Is there a federal policy, something that maybe the Trump administration should be doing, the next, congressional package, budget or whatever should be calling for certain policies? Is there anything from the federal level that could address housing more nationwide? Obviously here in Wisconsin, but everywhere.
I mean, zoning tends to be local. So yes, and local governments are the creatures of the state. So the state can, that's where you've got your leverage to tell communities that no, you can't nix new houses and tell everybody to move on, that you're going to be you're going to remain the edge of Metro Madison forever, for instance. Federally, the federal government had been for the past decade or two encouraging what they term as smart growth, which in the end means let's get everybody to bunch up together and stop expanding the footprint of metro areas. Let's stop suburbia. Oftentimes, it's cloaked in the idea that this way we'll get people to drive less. But again, these are trade-offs. That sort of quote unquote smart growth has led to, in places that most fully embraced it, absolutely unaffordable housing. Portland, Oregon is a classic example. The cost of land around Portland is comparatively low if you're outside the magical line that says you can't build any new houses past that line. If you're inside the line, house prices are exorbitant, and it's a classic example of a larger phenomenon. To the extent that the federal government is involved in doing this, in encouraging states to promulgate policies that limit what they term as sprawl, urban sprawl. Urban sprawl means somebody else's yard. That's what it comes to. And if you've got a federal government that's encouraging states through the way it hands out aid and grants to stop allowing houses to be built on farm fields when people want them, yeah, the federal government should stop doing that.
So again, it sounds like the culprit here is once again the government encouraging certain types of policies and practices that is making houses harder to build, therefore more expensive because there's just less houses.
You were talking about something earlier, and boy, it grates on me too, the whole idea that let's go blame boomer capitalism, and to a larger extent the belief setting in some quarters that free markets have failed. Capitalism's been tried, and all we're stuck with is houses we can't afford. Well, no, the whole point of discovering that a developer would really like to buy that field, the farmer would really like to sell it, because bluntly, that's the farmer's retirement. That's how he's going to move off to the panhandle of Florida and call it a day, because the kids are off in the city. They didn't want the farm, so he's going to sell it and he'll turn it into houses. See, it's a win-win, right? Except the local government says, no, we're zoning it for 5-acre lots, and no, it just doesn't pencil out at that rate. So is that capitalism? No, that's not. The free market said that a builder wants to build. He's not making money unless he sells it. People want to buy, and who's standing in the way? So I think your answer here is find out where free markets want to conduct, where participants in free markets want to transact business, want to have a willing buyer and a willing seller meet up, and somebody else is standing in the way saying, no, 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 no. We don't like the low class nature of your house, the houses that you're promoting there. Why they're only going to be $200,000 houses, which, by the way, is lower than the median price of any county in southeastern Wisconsin right now. Not to complain about the incumbent neighbors. I'm an incumbent neighbor in somewhere. We all are. We all live somewhere, and we presumably, although to be honest, I live about a half mile away from a EPA Superfund site. Found out after I bought it, but you know what? My life is just fine anyway. It's still a nice neighborhood. Um, so you can get used to quite a few things. But how much power are we going to give to the neighbors to dictate who moves in nearby? Uh, I think we really need to examine that.
Sure.
Pat, we at Will have always been in favor of competitive federalism. We don't really like this system where, that, Bill Buckley described as, the federal government creates a system where the sky is made black with crisscrossing dollars that, we tax money from Wisconsin and then we parcel it back out to them as long as Wisconsin does what we want. I don't encourage a federal solution to any of this as a general matter.
Please stop trying to help. You're only making it worse.
One of the things I do want to, I think will help sum up this conversation we've been having, though, is like we're heading, it's 2026, an election year. Affordability is a political topic. It's talked about all the time in that context. It's the number one rated issue, I think, for a lot of voters. How do conservatives, and I mean conservatives, not Republicans, right? Because I think sometimes there's differences. Rick would be the first to talk about that. How do conservatives win the battle of affordability, not just within the Republican Party, but nationally?
I think there are some good examples in Wisconsin. I'll be honest about it. Okay, one of them, and I'm just pulling from the great work that my colleagues at Badger have done. There's been some stunning reporting here by I'm not going to take credit for it. This is the work that others have done. But for instance, the Sheboygan area has a number of large manufacturers, haven't been able to get enough help since forever. And part of the deal is that it was hard to attract people to live in the area. Where are they going to live? A number of family-owned companies, Johnsonville Sausage, Kohler, Volrath, more or less got together and said, why can't we unfreeze the property market a bit and get something built? They worked with a local bank, bought some land, got Sheboygan Falls to agree to annex some fields, put up houses they're nice looking houses. Been past them, but they're not exorbitant. They're like nice normal houses that people who are, earning $70,000, $80,000 a year can afford. You can do that. This is a matter of essentially, as UW-Madison professor Kurt Paulson, who has done a lot of work on the economics of real estate, but it's a matter of getting the Chamber of Commerce people to stand up and say, yeah, let's build something. Let's allow it to be built. And that's happened there. Small scale. This is not like the answer for everything, but if you replicate that, and you can, you can get employers to prevail upon local authorities to bend and allow reasonably priced houses to be built. Hobart, West Suburban Green Bay, we did a piece on that. They're unusual in that they tend to say yes. They focus on growth, and not just and on growth in the sense of, what do you want to build? Okay, you've got a permit. As long as you meet the demands, the prearranged parameters for building there. They're putting up multifamily, they're putting up single family, and yeah, it's there's still the median house there is still going for something along the lines of high 300s, but that number has been rising at a much slower rate than other parts of suburban Green Bay, because again, there's some certainty offered to developers. That's half the battle right there. Seeing to it that the people who are, and the way developers work is they're plunking down their own money, and they're going to, in theory, earn it back in 2 years when they eventually sell the houses that they haven't built on the land that they have not graded. Um, they they want some certainty before they start plopping down money. Their lenders do. Uh, so to the extent that a place can, like Hobart, simply make the process predictable instead of such a gamble, you're going to get more things built. It's these bits on the margin. These are where your trade-offs are made.
Rick, what do you think, like for conservatives in general to kind of make the case for what we've been talking about today? Because I think there is an information gap in some ways.
Well, I mean, I think, traditionally, I mean, we've seen argument about it now, but traditionally, conservatives have tended to favor smaller rather than larger government and freer rather than more regulated markets, right? That doesn't mean that people are drawn to an absolute position like no government, no regulation. But the presumption should be that people ought to be able the market ought to be able to figure things out. Entrepreneurs should be allowed to uh, identify demands and meet them in a way which makes, sense for everybody. And so, I mean, I think that has to be the watchword. I think we have to, I think zoning has to be loosened up. Regulation of the housing market has to be loosened up. I think you have to be very, very careful in the way that you use subsidies because subsidies can drive up costs as frequently as they can lower, the cost for people that you're trying to help. And so I think all of that stuff has to be done, and the watchword has to be that people who are participants in the market, people who are putting their money on the line to identify and meet a demand, or putting their money on the line to obtain what they need to obtain for their family, are going to make better decisions than politicians. And so I think what we need is uh, less politicians getting up there and saying, I'm going to solve the problem. I'm going to bring down the price of eggs. I'm going to bring down, the price of housing. I think politicians need to understand that that's something that they can interfere with. It might be something that they can facilitate, but it's not something that they can do.
I think we have really talked about what's driving this housing issue, this affordability issue from a housing standpoint. I do think one other thing I just want to I think get to is we're seeing the conservative movement, we're seeing the Republican Party become far more working class. Affordability was one of the driving issues, I think, for Trump's election in 2024. Is there a risk, if any of this, of pursuing any of this, or is there a risk of losing working class voters or even more suburban voters going either direction here? Is there a trade-off when it comes to pushing one policy over another, when it comes to how the voter demographics are playing a role in our politics?
Well, I mean, that's always a risk, I mean, one of the concerns that I have is I'm not clear to me how the Republican Party can be at once the party of the working class and at the same time the party of limited government. I think that there is a tension there, and maybe that tension is reconcilable in the future by the right candidate, but there nevertheless is a conflict. And so what we've seen is, the Republican Party has become more reliant on working class voters who were not they come out for the presidential election. They're not as likely to come out for off-year elections. And so we see this situation where, Donald Trump was the first Republican to carry Wisconsin since Reagan. He did it two out of three times. But yet at the same time, during the period which he's done that, the Democrats have just cleaned up in statewide elections, for Senate, for governor, for Supreme Court, although they're formally nonpartisan, they're partisan. So, yeah, I mean, they're political risks. And when people are upset, it's always very difficult to go to them and say, uh, you know, um, going to trust the markets to figure this out for you because I can't do it myself. And it takes some flexibility. I don't think that you can be overly rigid about adhering to ideology in a situation like that if you want to win. But I do think that um, uh, notwithstanding that flexibility, there's a lodestar here that we have to adhere to, and I don't think that's been happening in recent election cycles, at least on the national level, on the part of the GOP.
I wonder if part of the problem is, I mean, customarily when you say party of the working class, that's sort of a paradigm that's been around since FDR, since the 30s, and defined by progressives, it has meant the party that will go get money from somebody else who shouldn't have it and doesn't deserve it as much as you, and it's going to give it to you. Well, that's not even the right way of thinking about it. That's it, it, what if we want to be the party of people who work for a living? Okay, that's not a. Uh, I don't like this whole proletarian versus bourgeois Marxist framing to begin with. That's so often attached to that. How about being the party that lets people figure out what works for them?
We had a guy that did that once. His name was Reagan. He did real well. The problem that we have now is it's a populist moment. And
Yes,
populism is always rooted in anger and frustration. That frustration and anger may be justified, but that's what it is. And
yes,
that requires a scapegoat. That requires somebody to blame. There has to be a they for there to be a populist movement. And but the other side of that, and is the good side of that is it can lead to the raising of issues that haven't been raised and attended to in the past. That's the good side. The bad side is that it tends not to respond to those concerns in a particularly constructive way. And the redeeming nature of it is that it always burns itself out. So, if you go back and you look at a guy like William Jennings Bryan, obviously his populist movement didn't result in much in the way of political success for him or for similar candidates, but it did raise issues that then the major parties had to deal with. And what we can hope for is that will happen too. But the Republican Party, it seems to me, if there's any reason at all for it to exist, has to be the party that says precisely what you did, Pat. This is a party that says, look, we can create the opportunity for human flourishing. We can help to create an environment in which that can happen. But the reality is that in this country, um, we, either individually or in voluntary associations, make our lives. We don't do it collectively. The government doesn't do it for us. And the Republican Party needs to be the party that stands for that message, I think, ultimately. Obviously, not with purity, not perfectly. I mean, that doesn't happen in politics, but that has to be the general direction of the effort.
I mean, so much of the critique that I hear these days, often labeled as being a populist critique of largeness. And I think there's something there about, we are bossed around and forced this direction and that by big corporation. Okay, yeah, big corporations will do that. They have the power to do that to the extent that they are able to use the regulatory mechanisms of the law. Uh, uh, a very large corporation that can afford a very large legal department is better able to play the regulators game than some upstart. So part of what I think we're going to need to do is explain that you can make room for the guy who's coming up with some utterly new way of doing things that you're going to like a lot better, and is illegal right now. How do we get the regulations out of the way? It's make room for people to invent things. This has always been what America's good at, inventing things. It's Europe that's locked into one old way of doing things. Here we're coming up with something new.
Before we wrap up, I know we want to just kind of pass along some smart takes on this topic of affordability and housing. And Patrick, we're going to start with you. Is there a book, a tweet, set of tweets, an account that you follow makes you smarter on this topic?
Can I recommend a book first? I want everybody to read this book. It's an older one, about 20 years old. It's called Sprawl, A Compact History. It's by Robert Briegman. I think he's now an emeritus, but he's a professor at University of Chicago. And one of the truly eye-opening things that he points out is that while it's often explained, you'll hear critics talk about urban sprawl as being, well, this is just American policy choices since some moment of original sin, the invention of the automobile or the end of streetcars. No, people have sprawled and cities have sprawled and people have spread out as much as the available technology of the day has permitted since approximately Roman times. And it's a good thing. It's a book that you need to read, Robert Briegman, Sprawl, A Compact History. In terms of keeping up on events, the American Enterprise Institute has a fine set of housing guys offering some ideas nationally. Tobias Peter, one of them. I pay attention to him. Not necessarily everything they say, but they know what they're doing. Who else is good on this? There's a journalist and commentator, Joel Kotkin. He's actually sort of an old-fashioned liberal, but he has a remarkably open-minded approach to how people should be allowed to set up cities, and urban forms should not be trying to shape what kind of people we are. They should follow it. They should follow people's preferences. I think he's got a lot to say. A guy named Judge Glock, of all things. It's a fabulous name, but he tweets, works at Manhattan Institute, quite bright on the idea of the economics of where things go. Robert Poole at Reason Foundation does transportation policy, not housing policy. But those two are so intertwined, since a lot of what the people want to restrict the forms of housing that are available in development, they're really trying to get at how we get around. Poole has some brilliant ideas on how to get past some of the bottlenecks in transportation that steer what's affordable in terms of homes.
Rick, what about you?
If you're looking for a book, that Phil Graham has written a couple of books with co-authors with Don Boudreau. The recent one this year was called "The Triumph of Economic Freedom," and it explains, goes through a number of these issues about the role of markets and government. He had another book with some other co-authors a couple of years ago called "The Myth of American Inequality." I think that was pretty good. There are some scholars associated with AEI, and I'm not talking about generally housing or transportation, but just sort of the role of markets. But there's a guy named Scott Lincecum, who I think is at AEI and writes for the Dispatch. Scott Winship, who I think is at AEI, and a guy named Michael Strain. These are economists that write a lot about markets. There's a guy at National Review called Dominic Pino, who I think is pretty good. There's another guy, David Bonson, who's an investment advisor, but who I think has I think it's called Capital Record, his podcast, and but a lot of really inside stuff about investing, but also I think pretty full-throated defense of free market economies and limited government.
Well, that's a great way to close out this episode. I think we did a good full-throated defense of capitalism as it comes to housing and affordability. I really want to thank Patrick for joining us. We appreciate it. We love seeing your stuff that you put out. And Rick, as always, thanks for being here with us. And, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And so we'll continue to be putting out episodes on a regular basis. And wherever you get your podcasts, you can catch us. Otherwise, go to will-law.org/podcast. We'll have every way imaginable to watch our podcast on that webpage. And stay tuned. There's so much more to come.